So my talk is going to be about learning from what we can learn from Heart FM, okay? Turn up the feel good, how we can turn up the feel good maybe in our public services, and how the answer to this is probably going to be quite radical. Okay, so I think about this stuff a lot. I kind of obsess about it, in fact, almost unhealthily. So just a couple of words about me, set the scene. I'm going to pay you the compliment of driving quite quickly, by the way. So I've got about 70 slides for my half an hour, but I promise you almost no bullet points in them at all. So hopefully we'll get through them quite easily. So I'm a professor in digital economy at University of Exeter Business School in a little group called Index, and we get really stuck into practitioners and practice, and try and have public impact, and my specialism is in public services. And I also co-run Methods Group, and Methods is a group of organizations that specializes in public service transformation. So there's full end-to-end transformation. We run a data science organization, which is currently playing its role in COVID analytics and fairly kind of relevant and serious activities at the moment. And also an organization called Core Azure, which does kind of what it says on the tin, helping organizations migrate to the Microsoft cloud. I mentioned I obsess about this stuff a lot, and I obsess particularly about the topic for today, which is how platform models, okay, how notably government as a platform might be able to apply to public services to change and to address a really growing problem about delivery, and also potentially just legitimacy of public services, which are increasingly, of course, getting squeezed and shutting the frontline delivery capability. And I also do quite a lot of blogging on this stuff, and probably about 5-6 years ago co-authored a book called Digitizing Government, which I guess has aged okay, actually. I would say that, wouldn't I? But many of the kind of core ideas around government as a platform and sharing and open standards, I think, have only become more relevant with the growth of cloud-based utilities and services. 2 or 3 years ago also, I co-launched a manifesto in the Institute for Government in London, which started looking at some of the nature of the savings that could potentially be diverted to the front line of public services. So I'm talking doctors, teachers, nurses, social workers, daycare centres, etc., and away from administrative bloat, effectively, if we started to get some of this thinking right. And of course, the prize is enormous, because that prize could actually safeguard our public services for future generations. At a time when at the moment they're under unprecedented threat. I think we can probably all agree. So just to kick us off, to kind of get to a kind of common baseline, what do I think, at least, what would I argue that was currently wrong with public services, but also with the whole digital conversation? And here, as I quite commonly do, I'm going to draw on a few slides from my friend Simon Wardley. Thanks, Simon. Part of the problem, of course, is that digital has become a bit of a sort of a bit of a coven, right? It's a bit of a club, isn't it? And there's a lot of buzzwords out there. Look at these ones: digital business, big data, disruptive, innovative, collaborative, competitive advantage, ecosystem. Interestingly, we hear quite a lot of these competitive words, even when discussing digital in public services, which is weird, isn't it? So we hear a lot of this stuff. I regard it as kind of digital bullshit, really, often. And in fact, we've become so inured to it that you could almost literally take a kind of template, a standard template, and insert those digital bullshitty terms into it. Our strategy is blah, we will lead a blah effort of the market for use of blah and blah to build a blah. And so by taking those kind of common words and putting them into the standard template, we can auto-generate lots of kind of just airware, just rubbishy digital strategies. It all sound good, customer focused. For that, read citizen focused. We'll lead a disruptive effort of the market through our use of innovative social media and big data, and we could go on and on all afternoon. Innovative digital business, you know, all the rest of it. Okay. The point is, it's utterly meaningless, really. And while we continue to preside over these sorts of documents and discussions, there are some real public consequences of our indecision, really, to inability to get things right. This is actually a GitHub, I think it's a GitHub hosted website that actually allows you to auto-generate digital strategies randomly on the basis of some of that digital bullshit you just heard, which kind of puts often professional services people like me out of business, maybe. So this is a book that made a big impression on me a few years ago. John Micklethwaite's one of the editors of The Economist, so probably slightly right of center, but what interests me is John Micklethwaite isn't interested in tech per se, okay, but still felt compelled to write, "The internet's revolutionized everything it's touched, from newspapers to retail. It would be odd if it didn't also revolutionize the state." But it's not revolutionizing the state, is it? We're just bolting websites and technology onto the existing ways of doing things. And whilst we do things, of course, we must remember that there are some very serious social consequences. Whilst we rush out all of these strategies, and whilst we think about what our models are, people are suffering out there because our public services are increasingly unable to deliver what is in their mandate to deliver. So obviously I'm going to be drawing on, I prefer really just to draw on general UK examples rather than focusing on Scotland, partly because I'm not a Scotland expert, but partly because I generally believe that the economics of cloud and platforms kind of best work at UK or even global level. The mantra "we're not special" is very important here. So again, just look at that. A third of councils dropping their housing spend by more than 50%. These are seriously worrying things. And of course, the political solution is often quite weak. Now, here's somebody I actually did some policy for quite a few years ago. I worked with Labour and the Tories. I'm not politically aligned, but this notion that we can either have more spending or cuts in public services, I think, is wrong, because the elephant in the room is we can actually change the business model of public services themselves, okay? And of course, a lot of the issues that we've got, we're living longer, we want to consume more services, there are more services potentially to consume, we've got a shrinking share of global GDP, all of these things before Brexit happened and before COVID happened have just accelerated or turbocharged what I've just been talking about. So one of the interesting things that came out, I think, of COVID was this notion that actually we're realizing that digital infrastructure is increasingly important in underpinning society and social institutions, from your Amazon delivery to even public services or delivery of vaccines themselves. So this is interesting, isn't it? And last week, some people breathed a sigh of relief. Some people may not have, but when Trump was deplatformed, right, from Facebook, etc., before then sitting back and thinking, oh, but maybe should Mark Zuckerberg have the power to render somebody a non-citizen digitally? And there are issues here. So we're beginning to realize actually that digital infrastructure, shared digital infrastructure, is a big deal. Should this be in the private sector, or should it be owned, and should the state take responsibility for actually running this? And so in summary, I think we've got a kind of blockbuster rather than Netflix government and public services business model, and we need to do something about it. So again, I mentioned some of these kind of some of these triggers, and just tinkering around the edges, my argument is we'll never ever get there. We've got to be radical. So what do we do about it? Well, quite often the answer is let's just build some stuff, okay? Blizzards of post-it notes, lots of people talking about Agile and user needs. And of course, Agile and user needs is vitally important to digital transformation. It's essential, but the danger is that it becomes, because it's quite seductive in its culture, here's some photographs of government digital service, because it's quite seductive in its culture, it becomes a meme. User needs and the language and iconography of Agile kind of takes over. The problem is we can't build something around the user needs specifically and bespoke to every citizen, okay? Apocryphally, Henry Ford said, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they'd have said a faster horse, which wasn't the right answer. Obviously, whether he said it or not is neither here nor there. The point is, we cannot bespoke services around the needs of every single citizen by building them from the bottom up. We can do it in other ways. I've been saying this stuff for a long time, of course. Here's a blog I wrote in 2014 called Searching for the Signal of Open Standards Amid the Growing Noise of Agile. So whilst we talk about Agile and user needs, we sometimes forget the other part to this whole digital story, which is adopting common, shared, open standards. And if we were able to do that, we'll be able to properly tackle, rather than gilding the lily, to properly tackle the broken business model of public services. And if we do that, if we want to tackle the business model, you have to take an aerial view. You have to take a collective view. So a local authority makes perfect sense when you just look inside the local authority, as does a healthcare trust, as does a charity. But if you zoom out and you look at these collectively, you realize that we all suffer from collective myopia, because we are reinventing the same thing again and again and again, and paying for it again and again, and outsourcing it and paying our suppliers for it again and again. And internally, we don't talk to each other. We are stuck in silos, and we are stuck in silos externally as well. And this is where my 46 billion that I referred to a bit earlier could come from if we were clever. So collectively, our public services are strikingly dysfunctional. And continuing like this, I think, is failing citizens, and it's failing the kind of social democracies upon which our social democratic institutions actually rest and are predicated on supporting. So this is a problem, because the legitimacy of the state itself may come under threat if we don't get this right. So a few of my favorite articles from the past, 14% of the budget in the National Health Service on management. I reckon you can double that, because that's a treasury figure. So maybe 30 to 40% of the NHS budget, not even touching a doctor or a nurse, just on non-clinical stuff that could be shared. I'm an academic. The problem is, and if you look at this article, we've had a 33% increase in managers, a bloat in higher education, against broadly the same number of academics and students. So why do we need more of these managers and administrators when the outcomes we're delivering are exactly the same? So I argue it's kind of going in the wrong way. Blockbuster once again. So I think cracks are appearing in the ice with COVID. I think people are beginning to realize that actually digital public infrastructure is something that we really, really need to focus on much more closely. And my own inspiration is Heart FM, which is, of course, the topic of this talk. So is the answer more post-it notes, blizzards of post-it notes, and people talking about Agile? No, I think, to borrow a slide from Mike Bevan, that's segueing the cavalry, if you like. It's taking an old model and it's updating it, which doesn't get anybody anywhere. So look at Heart FM. You look at this picture, this is how it represents itself. You've got local DJs, local advertisers, local revenue models, local weather, local traffic, local, okay? It's all very, very local. And you can see there's about 43 or so, whatever they are, local Heart FM radio stations. Except, of course, Heart FM also operates collectively. So it delivers locally, but it shares a lot of its back-end stuff collectively. So all of that managerial bloat isn't. You don't find that repeated and replicated again and again in each one of those local areas. So that's a kind of very sensible way of doing it, because it means everybody gets more up-to-date stuff, more up-to-date music, more up-to-date news. They can pump more effort and energy into configuring that to the needs of local listeners. Of course, Tim O'Reilly in 2005 or so had a similar idea he looks a bit like a Jedi Knight here. It's quite like this picture. He is a bit of a Jedi Knight, I think, in my view. He came up with this idea of government as a platform. So applying platform-based thinking of the sort of Amazons and Ubers of this world, and thinking, what would happen if we applied this to government, drawing on ideas of the New Deal in the 1930s USA. And since then, there's been a lot of debate about government as a platform that I don't have time to go into this afternoon. But recently, very recently, a couple of academics that I really respect, actually, particularly David Eves, came up with a report which looked at a kind of overview, the current state of digital transformation in governments globally. I highly recommend it. And I kind of like this updated working definition. So a platform isn't some massive slab of tech that we build and maintain in government. Really, it is more reorganizing the work of government around a network of shared APIs and components, open standards, canonical data sets, so that everybody can configure those locally to those common public goods locally and democratically to suit user needs. And this is a principle of something I've called focus and leverage. And for me, it's the kind of true north of digital business, but also organizing digital public services. So what does that mean? Well, you can see what I wrote in this Computer Weekly piece. Say you're a venture capitalist or an angel investor, a dragon, or a policymaker in government, or even a politician, and you're listening to someone pitching an idea. You're there to decide one thing, whether it's any good or not. So my point is, in the olden days, pre-digital, you would judge it on the basis of whether you liked what I was saying, whether you had a good track record, whether you'd like the focus, right? Whether you thought it was a good idea. In the digital era, it's the focus, what you propose to focus on, but also it is how you propose to turbocharge those things by leveraging cloud-based utilities and services. So I'm thinking machine learning, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, advanced analytics, obviously the data storage, the processing, and all of these kind of emerging technologies that we can share again and again and again, that can live in the cloud, and we can consume them like utilities. So if you put those two things together, that means that you don't spend my pile of cash, if I'm an investor, or taxpayers' money, if it's public services, on reinventing the wheel before you get to that little piece where you're adding some value and doing something that people value. Of course, Jaguar and Ford were doing this about 16 years ago. If you bought one of these cars about 16 years ago, when Jaguar was owned by Ford, you were actually buying a Ford. So there's a whole load, about 30% of Ford parts underneath this. In fact, a motoring journalist, noticed that Jaguar had the bad luck that the motoring journalist had recently reviewed a Ford Focus, and when they got into the Jag, noticed that some of these switchgear you can see here were actually the same as was in a Ford Focus. I actually argue that's pretty good management. Okay, so in other words, maybe they got that little bit wrong, but really, do you really care who manufactures the wire that connects the speedometer to the engine in the car? You don't. As a citizen, do you really care who manufactures or made the ERP system that sits behind a public service, or the CRM system, or any of those other elements? You don't care. And you certainly don't care if you're in local government or a charity or a healthcare trust, that it's a special property of that charity or local government or healthcare trust. You don't care. So down south, there's been something called a local digital declaration that I've had something to do with, which answers kind of the question of how do we get going if we want to share some of these things. So these are councils coming together and saying, you know what, from now on, we're going to sign up to this declaration and we're going to start sharing things like GitHub code libraries, okay, APIs, business cases, technology upgrade paths, transformation plans, mention business cases, all of these kind of, and entire functions and capabilities, like, I don't know, checking your identity. Okay, one of them builds them once, instead of doing them again and again, we start to share them and upload those things. And that's started to take off. It may take a long time, I'm not naive, but it's heading in the right direction. It's public organizations stopping pretending that they are owned by different shareholders and coming to share those things that citizens don't really care about, providing they do the job. I had a role in drafting elements of the UK government's transformation strategy, in particular these bits that talk about developing new common components, platforms, and capabilities. So certainly if you're thinking about this, there is the comfort that other people have been thinking about this before. Also, Scottish Government. As an advisor to the Scottish Government on digital, I wrote a piece for Government Information Quarterly, and I think there's quite a lot of similarity between that and, again, within Scottish Government, the desire to share things like making and booking an appointment, applying, receiving funds, making payments, appeals, registering ownership, and all the rest of it. These are like Lego bricks that can be shared again and again. And so we should be asking ourselves, in my opinion, what things do public sector organizations have in common, but are instead replicating again and again and again. As methods, we did a short piece of work a while ago now for Scottish Government, looking at how many agencies in government do licensing and registration. And when we boiled it and boiled it and boiled it down, we found that despite the fact it's done thousands and thousands of different ways across Scotland, actually it just comes down to these fundamental steps, this common service pattern. Do I need a license? Where do I get it from? Am I eligible? Okay, am I going to get one? And finally, give me my license. Okay, that's the basic essence of it. And underpinning those are a whole bunch of capabilities, all of which can sit in the cloud and be consumed like utilities once by everybody, and configured in different ways to meet the needs of local service providers. And we could take that approach looking across, of course, Scottish Government and public services, looking at justice, natural heritage, environment, and on you go to the right, with those common capabilities at the left appearing again and again and again. And again, this will take, 15, 20 years, but I fervently believe the market and increasing pressure on existing outdated models of public service delivery will get us there eventually. And potential adoption of all of these common kind of Lego bricks that you can see here. Another quick example for you to bring it to life. I did a study of a university. I won't tell you which one at the moment, but this is you don't need to look at all the writing in it, but this is a kind of deep dive on just how many mini empires and silos there are in a university. And each one of these little post-its and boxes has little ones inside them as well, all duplicating the wheel, all reinventing things again and again and again, and increasingly under pressure. We know universities are under pressure. So they look a little bit like Mark Foden's picture at the bottom here, lots and lots of silos. And what we've got to do is identify the common bits, some of the kind of common gubbins, as he called it, and the common machinery, the cloud-based utilities that we can share again and again and again. And if we start to do that, you could, for example, just take some of the quick wins. Look at a university. There's a whole bunch of these Lego bricks, again, for universities, that all of those university departments you see at the top could just draw on. And I won't go into them all. You can pause this video if you like. But we're doing some work around this, which is kind of quite interesting, and maybe might be teaming up with Microsoft to try and make some more sense and help people to use this technology better and once, rather than spinning it up again and again and again along the kind of Heart FM model. If we were to do that, just to make it even more real, some more examples of real stuff, real functions like Lego bricks that we can share in this particular instance to enhance student and academics experiences, right? So these are sort of CRM, customer relationship kind of functions. But this stuff, of course, we have citizen experiences. Public services is all about these experiences. We could share these things again and again, which is just as well, because like the local government digital declaration, look, here's a higher education digital declaration. Except it's not, because I faked it. I used the local government one and I invented this website. I wish this website existed, and I wish this website existed for public service, or for all public services, not necessarily government departments, but public services that need to come together and share things. So where there's widespread duplication, lots of organizations doing slightly different versions of the same thing. And the encouraging thing, I think, is that there's appetite for that in Scotland. So Neil sent me this, in fact, today, and thanks, Neil, because it's absolutely on the button here. So if you look at this, this month, Audit Scotland published the latest review of Scotland's local government progress, for example, and saying we need a national strategy, we need more skills, but we need common platforms. And then if you look down a bit further, the comments, no one's taking an aerial view. Councils want national direction and common platforms and collective national leadership. That's what I'm talking about. Do you remember I said that when you look inside any one particular organisation, things tend to make sense. You zoom out and collectively, do you remember I was saying we are strikingly dysfunctional? Then there could be some kind of quite radical results when you start to take this view, that there's really, we can start to kind of shift the non-essential stuff out of organizations and consume it out of the cloud. This is, I live near Tewkesbury, near Cheltenham, and I sat down with my local councillor in the pub about 3 years ago. Our councillor, my local councillor, was in charge of technology at the council, and he'd just been quoted a lot of money, over £100,000 by a consulting firm to redevelop the council's website. And he said, do we need to do that? And we had a conversation over a couple of beers in the pub. We went through a series of questions about the uniqueness of what we needed to do, as opposed to just a general kind of vanilla flavored, we're a very small council, vanilla flavored website. And as a result of that discussion, you can see here that actually we pay £150 a year for our service and our website. So that's a kind of example, another practical example of my own experience of applying this kind of Heart FM digital thinking. So if we're going to do this, we're going to take these silos like this, and we're going to try and identify the common elements and start to share those like platforms. We need to think more in terms of interoperability, of Lego bricks, and in particular, we need to think about opening stuff up. And I particularly like this exchange. It's quite well known in technology circles between Steve Yegg, who used to work for Amazon, and he's a software developer, and he's writing this thing about Jeff Bezos. And he loves and hates Jeff Bezos at the same time. He's trying to kind of get him out of his system. He looks a bit like a software developer, doesn't he? And he says, basically, I hate Jeff Bezos. You can kind of read it for yourself up there. But he says he's a super intelligent person because he did this mandate one day, and it went along these lines. All teams will expose their data and functionality through service interfaces, and you will use them, and there will be no other form of kind of bespoking or funny backdoors, etc. And because of that, it doesn't matter what technology you use. Okay, everything will start to fit together because you're exposing your service interfaces, APIs. Anyone who doesn't do this will be fired. Thank you. Have a nice day. I'm not sure how he came to this realization, the insight you can't build one product and have it be right for everyone, but it doesn't matter because he gets it. And it's the most important thing in the computing world, and it's called accessibility. Okay, so accessibility is all about breaking big monolithic systems down into kind of Lego bricks, but making them very, very accessible so that you can plug them together in different ways to be very, very locally relevant to citizens in our case. And the results of this, here's an example of taking this focus and leverage approach and bolting stuff together. So I particularly like this, TransferWise. So it's a simple fintech startup. You can send money or receive money abroad to other countries. So you can see the UX, the lovely digital user-centered service design here. I can type in the money here and I see exactly what my family gets overseas. It's lovely, it's simple, it's intuitive. And yet you look at it and it's actually powered underneath it by Currency Cloud Direct, a white label payments platform built using APIs to give you an out-of-the-box payment solution. So again, they got this wonderful user-centric, locally configured, very, very appropriate service by focusing their money and their time on that and white labeling the stuff that I don't care about, which means if you're Western Union, the equivalent, if you like, of the traditional government business model, you're going to die. I would be very worried if I was Western Union. Been around for 100 years, vertically integrated, an old model, carrying all sorts of costs and administrative bloat that these guys just don't carry. And if you go on the underground, these were, excuse me, they happen to be from London, but if you start looking at some of the advertisers and all of these digital startups, they all have this, okay? None of them are building everything from the ground up. They have their focus on the customer, and most of the rest of it that powers it are common functions in the cloud. Now, I won't go through this particular slide here because I'm going to run out of time unless I'm careful. My point is Lego, leverage and focus, and think about being collectively sharing like platforms. This guy's here just because I like him. He's a fantastic Lego spaceman. So just to kind of wrap up, this stuff is hard because I genuinely believe that the models out there, the technologies are out there, as Mark Andreessen wrote 10 years ago. He said, finally, all the tech works and can be used at scale. So what are we going to do about it collectively? What are we, when we're in policymakers, when we're politicians, when we are in senior tech roles in public services, going to do to take an aerial collective view of the broken model? This is not just digitizing public services, it's digitalizing them. It's not shoving them in the cloud, it's thinking about how we can redesign them to use these amazing capabilities we now have and actually save public services for future generations. So we don't bang on, if you look at the left, on vertical and not invented here, we're special and data's risky and we've got to be risk averse, and we don't bleat transform unless we've got an idea what on earth we think we're transforming to. You'll see at the bottom, instead of digital being about tech and agile, I've written on the bottom right, digital is about a shift in the business model. And digital businesses operate collectively. They share the utility kind of stuff and they just focus where they add value to customers. So as my last slide, I did something last year. This is another spoof, and it got a few people running around, including a few people in Scotland, actually. So by kind of showing not telling, this spoof is a kind of what I would like to see. I would like to see a localism in the digital economy bill. And you can see it basically says we're going to redefine what localism means. Localism isn't a fig leaf for you to reinvent the wheel again and again and just bleat that you're being local, because you're not serving local needs in the digital economy by doing that anymore. And it says, if you look at point 2, since 2011, the acceleration, proliferation, and maturing of the digital economy means loads of powerful new admin services can be consumed from the cloud cheaply and at scale. And if you do that, public authorities can center around citizens, shift resources to the front line, share data and become smarter, upgrade services automatically, and everything will get better. So we need to redefine, politicians need to wake up and redefine how we can best meet local needs by sharing things collectively. And that's why public services are broken at the moment. And that's why we can all learn from Heart FM. In fact, this is my final slide, apologies. So this is a chief exec. It's not a CTO responsibility. It's not about passing it to your chief data officer or chief digital officer. This is a business responsibility. It's the business model. And my recommendation for everybody is to establish an empowered central architecture function accountable to the chief exec, which is responsible for evolving to this common architecture. Interestingly and encouragingly, Scottish Government is undertaking projects at the moment to have a common spend control function. And spend control functions will start also to provide support to the idea that before you get your big dollop of money to spend on technology, we make sure that it is heading in the right collective direction and that it can be shared and consumed by other people, which is a fantastic start at the center as well for this kind of work. So I've thrown a lot at you quite quickly. I did say I would drive quickly. I apologize that the first few slides didn't pick up. They were great slides too, but I'll share the slides with everybody afterwards in case you want to have a look. So thank you very much for joining me this afternoon, and yeah, any questions if anybody is there?
Yeah, sure. Mark, thank you for this great session. So stay with us just a few minutes more to the Q&A. Session. It's right now, and we already received some during the presentation, so thank you to the audience. The first one is from Who. Sorry if I mispronounced the name. Question very short, but slightly complex. How does GDPR fit into this?
How does GDPR fit into this? Okay, so I always survive by not pretending to be an expert across everything. So I'm not setting myself up as a GDPR expert. What I would say, however, is that strategically, GDPR is part of a whole plethora of issues that we have about data, about governance, about taxation of cloud, and about general regulation and understanding of how public services makes use of utilities, which are often provided by the private sector. And I think society as a whole, and particularly when it comes to data regulations, have a heck of a lot of catching up to do. I do think that it is very possible to have canonical data sets, to have a maturing of data models, of data architectures, of in particular ethics frameworks surrounding the use of data, which I know is coming up the policy agenda of all sorts of people at the moment. I do think it is possible to combine an open, accessible and modular approach to public service utilities around sharing with a reasonable degree of data security. I have never seen anything which has given me cause to believe that those things cannot be achieved. And if you think about it, in many ways, all sorts of large private sector platform organizations manage to keep our data secure with minimal scandal. Mistakes do happen, of course, we're all human. So why can't we adopt many of those same technologies and architectural approaches and provide a reasonable degree of data security to our citizens? I believe it's absolutely possible, but as I say, I'm not a data expert, and I wouldn't set myself up as one.
Right, thank you. The second is from Richard. Two questions in one. What are the main barriers to agreeing commonality to achieve digital platform for the multitude of government departments with their own needs and agendas, and how do we overcome them?
So listen, this is a fantastic question, and it's the kind of question I was hoping that I'd been asked. So I think, and this is, we're going to have a whole seminar or session about this, so I'm going to try and be quick. If this was easy, then we'd have done it already. And I'm not here to tell anybody this is easy. And I'm not naive. I've been doing this stuff for 25 years. I believe this sort of transformation will take 15, 20, 25 years before public services are powered by a common set of utilities, in the same way is that a common electricity is powering all of our homes at the moment. It's like that. We could have a public commons around this, which absolutely strips non-value add activity out of our public services and just consumes them centrally. I genuinely believe that's the case. The problem is, of course, ultimately, I believe it's the people, and I think you rightly kind of touch on that a little bit. So, who are the people in charge? They're the people who often, particularly in the commercial world, of course, are 2 or 3 years away from retirement, the golden paycheck, and the golf course. Are they really going to be the ones to rip the organization apart? In the private sector world, it's often called the innovator's dilemma. So if you're sitting on the top of a market, at what point do you cannibalize your own market by cutting, by changing your own business model when you're sitting pretty and somebody else can solve the problem? Now that sounds like a kind of soft answer to you, but I genuinely believe the more work I do in this area, the more actually we are naive if we not do consider the people and the politics. So not invented here syndrome is quite convenient. And as I mentioned in the presentation, the biggest fig leaf for this is localism. Okay, talking about being local, we don't want your standard stuff. This is local stuff for local people, and of course, it's a lie. Now, it is a lie. I believe that stuff is a lie. It wasn't a lie in the last century, but now, of course, we can serve local people's needs far better if we can configure modular components and capabilities around them and learn from the data and keep evolving public services using that intelligence. And all of those things only come by using these kind of common utilities at the back end and having open standards for sharing. So it's extremely difficult. I mentioned, I guess, two things. Well, I mentioned a top-down example, which is in Scotland, the Spend Controls project, which is happening at the moment, and various countries, Government of Canada, Australia have done some of the D5, the Digital 5 countries have, and of course it was done in London in the early 2010s. So that's a top-down approach that attempts to ally budget with behaving yourself on architecture. Okay, so if you propose to reinvent the wheel, you ain't going to get the budget. So there's that sort of bringing those two together, I think is a very good wake-up call for some people to get them in the tent. And I think the other thing we can start to see, and I'm a real fan of, and I mentioned a couple of examples, is local declarations. So if you work in a sector where there's widespread duplication, you can get together around a website and a movement and start to share these things. And I gave a stream of examples of things that we can start to share to kind of build that movement. And ultimately, you want to evolve that movement into a common back-end architecture, which is expressed in different ways locally to meet local needs.
Mark, you were talking about government capabilities, and we have a question coming from John linked to this. Given the change resistance of the public sector, what is the big catalyst needed to bring about this type of radical transformation? For example, a very tech-savvy politician from the top down, or entrepreneurial tech teams from the bottom up?
So again, and another great question, almost a sort of extending what we were talking about previously. So I believe it's top down and bottom up. So why do I say that? I think understanding digital business is a yin and a yang. It's agile at the local level, but it's about architecture and open standards and common standard stuff at the kind of central level, right? And it's understanding the tension between those. So it's understanding how subscribing to common things, common standards, can actually enable us to be more agile and more local. So there is a role, I believe, taking the centralized bit for centralized bodies. You know, you just look at, I don't know, the standards body for the World Wide Web. You know, the World Wide Web wouldn't work for all of us unless there was a central standards body that was actually allocating, you know, web domains and all of that kind of stuff. We have to have certain kind of collective, not owned by anybody, but collectively owned central standards functions and standards bodies. And spend control, I think, is a good example of that in public sector. But also, we need to encourage people to use those. So again, local movements that come together is great. In terms of a catalyst, of course, I mean, I genuinely believe that Brexit and COVID are placing public services to the strain like never before. But as I mentioned, and I'm sorry you didn't see some of those early slides, public services were broken, in my view, before then. It's a 20th century model where all this, the definition of a legacy organization is an organization that grew up its people, its processes, and its technology in the era before the internet, before we had the ability to share quite a lot of those functions. And so our public services collectively are all legacy organizations. And I believe they will all die eventually. They will literally run out of money. And we can see them running out of money, you know, and that was my point at the beginning. It depends which end of the telescope you're on. You know, I'm at a comfortable end of the telescope. I get to talk about digital policy and co, but I don't depend on a lot of the public services that some people do, for whom public services are you know, a last option, of which they have no choice. And public services are failing these people at the moment. So I believe it's a collective failure of public servants not to organize ourselves collectively and take advantage of this incredible new technology. And again, it's if it was easy to do, we'd have done it. So I'm not saying this is easy, but I'm saying it's our duty, it's our moral, it's our ethical duty, in my opinion, to do it. And I think the catalyst is happening. It's obviously sped up because of recent events, but it's happening now because we are literally running out of money.